Okay, so welcome everybody. We are at class number 13 in our trek through Jewish history. I know this was supposed to only be a 10-week class, but I'm glad that you have all stuck with it this far, both people who have been here since week one and people that have joined in halfway through. You are all welcome, and it's been incredible, this process of learning with everybody. And I'll just say, putting together the material and really trying to think in every really century or 2 centuries what the most important ideas in Jewish history have been, and what sort of those ideological tension points and sociological conditions that Jews found themselves in, and what is sort of important to highlight, has been a lot of fun and very interesting for me over the past couple months. So I've definitely gotten to learn a lot during this experience. So just as we always do, a little recap of where we're at in Jewish history, and then we're going to cover another 300 years today. So last time we really ended off our medieval chapter of Jewish history, and we spent a lot of time talking last session about the varieties and various forms of anti-Semitism in which Jews, especially in the Middle Ages, found themselves under. And we talked a lot about what caused a lot of this anti-Semitism, a lot about how this anti-Semitism subsequently affected the wider Jewish community. Another note, when I actually uploaded the video recording from last session, we immediately got a slew of anti-Semitic comments on a video about anti-Semitism. So just in terms of what the question, which we all of course know the answer, is anti-Semitism still around? The answer is of course, which obviously makes it that much more important to learn about it. But today we are, again, just like the vast scope of Jewish history has always trekked on, today in our class we are going to trek on and talk about the pre-modern stage of Jewish history. So just to sort of contextualize why this is another inflection point in Jewish history, and then we'll go right into some sources. In the year 1492, and I'm going to share my screen so we can start the slideshow. As we finished off last week, we really discussed how this really shook up the Jewish world. And again, the Jewish world that was centered around Spain and Portugal, and really for about 400 years, if anybody were to ask you where the cultural, intellectual, religious center of the Jewish world was, it would have been in the Iberian Peninsula, mostly Spain, but also Portugal. And once the church took over and the subsequent expulsion from Spain and the Inquisition that followed, Jews really had another round of geographical mix-up. And so we ended off last time by talking about where all of the various Jewish communities that were kicked out of Spain and Portugal went. And so obviously a great number ended up going both south and east to the Ottoman Empire. We're going to discuss that today and what happened in the Ottoman Empire. Another very large number ended up in Italy. And Italy in the 15 and 1600s becomes another one of those big cultural centers that we'll talk about today. Extremely significant for getting into more modern Jewish history. Many Jews ended up in the wider area of Poland. And at that time, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth comprised of a lot more of what we think of Poland on a map today. It was Poland, Lithuania, most of Ukraine. And so Poland ended up ushering in a golden age of Jewish history in the 1500s. It was one of the best places worldwide to be Jewish. And so the reason why we are officially done with the Middle Ages is because now it has been a complete mix-up. And now Jews are facing a lot of modern situations, which of course, in the next couple of classes, through the Enlightenment, through obviously the 19th and 20th century anti-Semitism, and finally the return to Israel and American Judaism that we find ourselves in today, we'll see how there's sort of a direct line from all the various sociological conditions that we're going to talk about today until then. So we'll hop right in. Again, just like always, if you have any questions or comments, please interrupt in the middle. So let's go first. So this is going to be a little bit of a traveling through wider Europe and the Middle East here, because there's a lot of different geographical regions to talk about, and what happened in different geographical regions, I think, will paint a really interesting picture of what happened in the 15 and 1600s, the 16th and 17th century. So we have a lot of Jews ending up in Italy, and Venice was probably one of the most famous cities that Jews in the 1500s ended up in. And Venice is also famous for starting or being the first of what we think of as Jewish ghettos. And so one way to conceptualize this, and if you see this picture that's down here, you can see how the houses and the buildings were built specifically so that there would be a closed off area. if you want to see actually an aerial map of what the city of Venice looks like, both historically and now, this little area that's obviously built architecturally different than the rest of the city was the Jewish ghetto. And this is, of course, a direct link from all of the anti-Semitism that we were talking about in our last class for countries that didn't expel the Jews, but obviously still harbored a great amount of governmental anti-Semitism. You had all of these situations where they would forcibly have areas that all the Jews had to live in. And of course, this continued well into the 20th century, right? The other name for this, of course, in Yiddish is the shtetl, right? They have slightly different academic meanings, but the connotation is the same, mainly that in all of these major cities, there were specific areas that Jews had to live in. There were areas that Jews could not live in. And so this forced a situation where Jews were segregated by governmental policy and ended up then creating, of course, pockets of Jews in all major cities. And so this is, of course, right, you can still today go to Venice, Italy as a tourist, and you can walk around and you can still visit the Jewish ghetto, of which now I think I was in Italy a couple summers ago. There's now a couple kosher restaurants and a Chabad yeshiva there. So if you're wondering, what the future of this little Jewish pocket of Venice is, it is alive and well. But this is common, and this was commonplace governmental policy all over Europe in the 15 and 1600s. And then, of course, it only increases until really emancipation, which we'll talk about next time. But this was the normal status quo. And Italy is sort of the exemplar, because it is the first time, right? The word ghetto is, of course, an Italian word, but this is the beginning of whenever you see the word ghetto in relation to Jewish history, right? This is exactly what it was. And the architecture here of Venice, Italy is very commonplace, like it would have been across all sorts of major European cities. We also, of course, right, interestingly enough, right, in the wider stream and trek through Jewish history, right, the 1500s was a very important time for wider European history, right? You had the Protestant Reformation, and then also you have the Renaissance movement that starts to see a proliferation and growth of arts and poetry and all of this culture, which again starts this slow moving movement until what we call the Enlightenment. And so we're going to hold off on the Enlightenment until next time, but the Enlightenment was probably the most important event in Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple. And so we're going to talk a lot about the Enlightenment and how virtually any Jew that's alive today that's practicing Judaism in any form, and it doesn't make a difference if you are a liberal Reform Jew, it doesn't make a difference if you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew, it doesn't make a difference if you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, right? Right now in the year 2023, the Enlightenment has had an effect on virtually the type of Judaism that we all practice. And to some extent, this owes its intellectual roots to the Renaissance, which again, didn't just affect, right, Italy and Venice at this time, but really led to the proliferation of all sorts of culture that would eventually begin to challenge the supremacy and status quo of the Catholic Church and religion over the public sphere. Now, one important name that I just wanted to call out, in case anybody is looking for sort of an individual figure to think about in terms of Venice and this time period, it would be Isaac Don Abarbanel, who is to this day probably one of the top 10 Jewish biblical commentators that you would go to if you're, say, preparing something to say on a Shabbat morning, right? The Abarbanel was actually born in Portugal. He then, as a result of anti-Semitism, fled to Spain, and as a result of anti-Semitism, fled to Europe and eventually ended up in Venice. And he becomes an extremely important person, both in Jewish, but also in wider intellectual circles. And now here's where we get to one of the interesting complexities of Jewish identity and Jewish ideology. So we spent 2 entire classes talking about the clash between the rationalism of Maimonides and the mysticism of the anti-Maimonidean camp. And for those who have no idea what I'm talking about, right, I believe it's classes 10 and 11. And Isaac Abarbanel represents a sort of new type of Jewish ideologue that no longer views mysticism and rationalism as opposites, but actually fuses them into his worldview, much like probably a lot of Jews today. And so one way to describe Isaac Abarbanel was both a Maimonidean and a Kabbalist. Now, in the 1200s, that would be an utter contradiction. But by the 1500s, as Kabbalah spread all throughout the Jewish world, any Jew that was alive in the 1600s, 1700s, right, certainly the 21st century, is so steeped in a Jewish worldview that was affected by Kabbalah that you can be both a rationalist and also have the sort of leftover baggage from Kabbalah. And this class, in some way, is actually going to connect a lot of past classes. I actually had a friend that was an old friend of mine from high school asked me, I was talking to him about Jewish history, and I was telling him about this class, and he said, well, can you send me the links? I want to listen to the recordings. And then he said, is it cumulative? Meaning, if I miss some of the classes, does it make sense to hop in the middle? And I said, well, yes, you can hop in the middle. Most of the time, it's not cumulative, but every once in a while, right, there are going to be important building blocks that do build on past classes. And today is going to be one of them. And we'll see why in a minute, because in the 16 and then 1700s, we go through some of the most important events in modern Jewish history, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it was directly an offshoot from the spread of Kabbalah throughout the Jewish world, mixed with another dark episode of anti-Semitism. And so we'll discuss that as we get to it. But one way to think of this is Kabbalah is now mainstream, right? As opposed to the sort of type of Kabbalah that we saw in the Zohar or Nachmanides, where Kabbalah was mostly meant for a couple of elites at the top. Kabbalah at this point in the 15 and 1600s, as a result of what happened in Tzfat, which will be the next slide, was already now commonplace in the Jewish community. And so anybody who wanted to be involved in the Jewish community, right, Kabbalah was just a part of their Judaism, right? One interesting way to think about this, right, just in terms of frameworks, is in the 21st century, I think to some extent we can all agree that Zionism in Israel, regardless of our opinion about Zionism in Israel, right? We'll talk about Zionism probably in 2 weeks, but regardless of our opinion about Israel, Israel is now a mainstream part of being Jewish, right? Zionism is a part of Judaism in a fundamental way that if we went back in time to the 1700s, very few people were talking about a return to a homeland and Zionism and right, obviously they had messianic ideas of a return, but in terms of a political return, right, that was not a commonplace idea. All of a sudden, to be involved in Jewish community and to be involved in Jewish community leadership in the 21st century means that you're probably steeped in Zionistic thought, Zionistic worldviews. You have a connection to Zionism, you have an opinion on it. So Kabbalah went through that same thing, right? It started off as sort of a fringe movement, and now Kabbalah starts to seep into the wider Jewish world to the point where even an intellectual rationalist like Isaac Abarbanel, right, has a deep-rooted knowledge of Kabbalah. And we also start to see something else in the wake of the expulsion from Spain that, again, will be extremely important to understanding what happened in the Jewish world in the 1600s, which is the Jewish world underwent a strong dose of what we might call messianic fever. And right, this makes sense from everything we know about both Jewish history and human psychology, right? Usually, if everything in the world is going great and perfectly, right, you're not thinking of a utopian thing or leader or opportunity to save you, right? Usually it's when things are going bad, when tragedy strikes, when disaster happens, that all of a sudden you're able to get these populist leaders that come in with utopian or dystopian worldviews that all of a sudden are able to convince tens or hundreds or millions of followers to follow them in whatever their worldview demands. And certainly the expulsion from Spain in 1492 as a major inflection point in Jewish history opened up the door to a lot of messianic claims, because the idea is, well, things can't get much worse than this, right? Therefore, right, if you already believe strongly in the idea of eventually a messianic return, which again, the idea of the Messiah is not a new idea in Judaism, right? Anybody who reads the prophets, right, Isaiah and Jeremiah, right, talk all the time about a messianic figure. If you read the Talmud, they talk all the time about a messianic figure. But very seldom in Jewish history was messianism at the forefront of a worldview, right? If you had to encapsulate, right, an 8th century Jew's view of the Messiah, it's, yeah, something that's going to happen one day, but let's not worry about it, right? We'll cross that road when we get to it. All of a sudden now in the 1500s and 1600s, and this is only going to increase until a bursting point, which we'll discuss in a couple slides, Messianism was on everybody's lips, right? And everybody was just counting down the days until, the great shofar blows and everybody's ushered back into the land of Israel. Because again, when things are this terrible, right, it's only natural that you're going to look for some way out. And so there was also a high dose of Messianism. And then, of course, right, the jobs that Jewish people in Venice were engaged in, right, this will not surprise anybody, but Jews were central in the banking system, in the textile system, and also the printing press, which was also a new invention. And so this, again, to some extent, is a direct offshoot from what we discussed last time, where there were specific jobs that Jews were forced into. Certainly a lot of jobs around finance, right, where Jews were relegated to those positions because the wider Catholic Church didn't want to touch certain jobs around money. And for a whole variety of other reasons, Jews found themselves in the merchant business around tech, right, things that, again, would continue into the 18 and 1900s in the textile factories, right, in the printing press. And the printing press, right, just the last thing I'll say about this, right, and this is sort of general world history, but it's worth mentioning here alongside Jewish history, the effect that the printing press had on the world was probably just as big as the effect that the internet had on the world. I mean, suddenly every congregation, maybe if you imagine how it worked in the 1200s, would have one set of Talmud for the entire congregation. And so if you're a Jew in Orange County, let's say, and you wanted to know what the Talmud says, the chance of you ever being able to look at a primary copy or source of the Talmud was very little, right? Maybe the rabbis of the different communities would get a chance to study it, but almost always you were using secondhand accounts, or there was still a lot of oral tradition that was involved in it, right? If you wanted to, let's say Fred wanted to understand what the Midrash said on last week's Torah portion, Parsha Truma, right? There would be almost no chance that Fred would be able to access an actual copy of the Midrash. So he would have to go to the community rabbi and ask the rabbi, and the rabbi either would know it because he studied it in yeshiva, or the rabbi would then have to maybe travel to the Beit Midrash or to the synagogue, of which they might have had one copy, right? And actually look through that copy on a scroll, right? All of a sudden, of course, the printing press changes that. And the situation that we have today, where probably in all of our bookcases, and certainly the bookcase at any synagogue or any Jewish community center, is full of all of basically the Jewish wisdom from all of history. And so this obviously creates a democratization of information and knowledge, where it's worth pointing out, Judaism has never been a tradition that is attempted to be only for the elite in terms of learning knowledge, right? We don't really believe that only the heads of community should be studying Torah. But in terms of practicality of what happened, if we imagine what the reality was 1,000 years ago, it really would have been only the head of the community studying Torah, not for any ideological reason, but for a practical reason. All of a sudden now, the printing press allows every single Jewish home to have a copy of the Torah, to have a copy of the Talmud, to have a copy of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and again, create a condition where you have a spreading out of knowledge, and information can travel from one Jewish region to another very quickly. And so we get to our next stop, which was probably the biggest cultural influence in the 1500s.
Rabbi, can I interrupt you one sec? Can you go back to that previous slide?
Yes.
Okay, when we took the tour of the Jewish quarter, Cindy and I, when we were in Venice, and I think Ruth was the one who made the comment about how they gated you in at night to protect you. But what you notice in there, which you can't really tell, is these are high rises compared to the other buildings. So if you looked at all the other buildings that were built around there, they were all like 2 stories, and these things were high rises. They really packed the people into this small space. That wasn't what everything looked like in Venice. And then within that small area, there were like 3 synagogues. Okay, I mean, if you could believe that, within around that one little square. That's so you could imagine how many people were packed into this tight little quarter. And I just wanted to point that out because it's obvious since I took the tour, that's what you're looking at there, but it isn't so obvious because you're not looking at the surrounding buildings, which were maybe 2 stories high typically.
Yeah, 100%. Let me see if
I have a question.
Yeah, go for
it. Fred, those buildings are relatively modern buildings that we see there, aren't they?
When we took the
No, they're not.
No,
They're not.
You know, a lot of Venice doesn't change very much. So this is what you were looking at 4 or 5 story buildings, which didn't exist really when you walked around Venice. They weren't 4 or 5 story buildings. Maybe some of the modern ones were, but these old buildings were not this big. This was specific to this area.
Yeah, I believe, I mean, if I'm remembering this correctly, you know, from 6, 7 summers ago, the external, I mean, the actual buildings themselves are the same physical buildings. They've been renovated and, you know, on the inside to some extent. But yeah, Henry, I believe they're the same buildings. And it's a great point, Fred, in terms of, yes, right. They obviously tried to stuff in as many Jews as possible. And just while we're on the subject, just a couple other things. I think I mentioned this last week, but it's worth mentioning again, that even during the day when Jews left the ghetto, they actually did have to wear certain types of clothing that distinguished them. And so I mentioned this last week, but oftentimes we think of Jews having to wear, say, the yellow star to be just a Nazi creation. But if you were a Jew in Venice in, let's say, the year 1600, and you wanted to leave the ghetto to do whatever you had to do in sort of the main city, or you wanted to go to the port or whatever, right, you had to wear something that distinguished you as Jewish. And just one other statistic, right? One of the interesting parts about Venice and why it became such an interesting Jewish cultural center is that you had this, even with all these conditions, right? This might shock some of you, even with all these conditions that I'm talking about and everything Fred pointed out in terms of being stuffed in, this was one of the best places in Europe to be a Jew in the 15 and 1600s. And so Venice was attracting Jews from all over the rest of Europe, right? Especially Western Europe. This was the place to be. And just one statistic I saw while prepping for this is that 1/3 of the total Jewish literature that was produced in the 17th century came out of Venice, Italy, in terms of commentaries, in terms of information, books of philosophy, books of Kabbalah. And so this really did become a cultural center of Judaism, despite all of the restrictions that were placed on Jews, right? You basically cram all of the people into this area, and then all this creativity explodes from it. And just the last thing I'll say, and we have a lot of other cities and interesting historic episodes to get through, so I don't want to spend too long just talking about Italy, even though we obviously could spend the whole time talking about just this, is that in the 1800s, once the emancipation starts to come through Europe, right? It obviously starts off in France with Napoleon, but soon spreads to the rest of Western Europe. And within about one generation, you have all this governmental policy that all of a sudden lifts off the restrictions of where Jews have to live, and metaphorically and literally opens the ghetto walls. This, of course, represents a very important turning point in Jewish history and leads to, again, what we call the Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, led to the difference in Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and all that stuff we're going to talk about next week. But we can remember this picture for when we discuss it next week, because again, right, from everything we know about history, it's very difficult to go from a situation where for hundreds of years, you are relegated to certain areas in your city and have to wear a special star and you're locked in at night and all of these things, to all of a sudden go to complete freedom and assume that all of that baggage has just left. But we'll get up to all of that next week. Now we can travel a bit eastward and end up in the city of Tzfat, right? This is a picture of the city of Tzfat. Tzfat in Hebrew, by the way, means viewpoint, because for anybody who's been to Tzfat, right, there is a beautiful view. And actually the view of what you're looking at is Meron, which is a small city that's actually cut out of the picture, but it would be right here. And now Meron is interesting because Meron is the supposed burial place of a rabbi named Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because in the week that we talked about Kabbalah, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is viewed by Kabbalists to have been the founder of Kabbalah, right? And if you do a quick Google search of who wrote the Zohar, you're likely to get two answers. If you ask an academic, the answer is going to be Moses de Leon in Spain in the Middle Ages. And if you ask a deep religious Kabbalist, they're going to tell you it was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And so when the modern city of Tzfat was founded, right, it was founded specifically looking over to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's gravesite. And so this was a city that was basically built on Jewish mysticism. And for anybody who's traveled to Tzfat today, knows that it's one of the most artsy and cultural and wacky, in a good way, places in the entirety of the Jewish world. Now, just a couple of facts about Tzfat, and we can talk about its effect and cultural influence on the rest of the Jewish world. So Tzfat is obviously in the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire controlled the entirety of the Middle East up until World War I. And in the Ottoman Empire was a time of, again, relative tolerance for Jews. And especially after the expulsion from Spain, many Sephardic Jews ended up going down to the Ottoman Empire. And actually, the community that ended up in Tzfat was basically direct exiles from Spain. And so a lot of the continuity of the Spanish mystical, poetic, artsy culture that was alive in the golden age of Spain basically moved itself to Tzfat. And so you had a time where in the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, you now had 600,000 Jews. So the Ottoman Empire had, again, more Jews than any other empire in the world in the 1500s. And this is the birthplace of a man who would become probably the most important figure in the history of Kabbalah, a man named Isaac Luria, otherwise known as the Arizal. And Isaac Luria was the person who was responsible for spreading Kabbalah to the rest of the Jewish world. And so obviously the Zohar and Nachmanides and everything we discussed a couple weeks ago, they laid down the intellectual foundation for Kabbalah. But Kabbalah in those times was sort of for the intellectual elites, right? If we talk about it in modern terms, Kabbalah might have been something that you learn in certain graduate school courses, but that the layperson would have no idea what you're talking about when you started talking about Kabbalistic ideas. And Isaac Luria takes this sort of lofty intellectual view of mysticism and breaks it down into basically bite-sized digestible ideas for the entirety of the Jewish world. And importantly, and I think this actually gets us into an interesting conversation about what allows ideas to have lasting power in the Jewish world, Isaac Luria doesn't just keep Kabbalah as an ideological set of principles, but he actually creates a series of rituals around it to ritualize Kabbalah. And so one of the things, right, one of the most famous things that Isaac Luria does, right, he does a lot of famous things, but probably the most important is Kabbalat Shabbat, which of course is now a staple in virtually any Jewish community, right? The idea that Friday, right before sundown, you go outside and you greet the Shabbat who's engaged in this, beautiful metaphor as a bride, and Shabbat's really viewed as this wedding, right? And if you read the poem of Lecha Dodi, right, again, one of the staples of a Kabbalah Shabbat service, this was also written in the 1600s, in the 16th century in Tzfat, right, by another mystic. And so Tzfat at this time, right, and again, this was the community that was just exiled from Spain and Portugal, right? This was a community that had witnessed destruction and disaster and pain and exile, and perhaps half their family, if not more, stayed back in Spain and Portugal, right, because they didn't want to have to leave, right? This was a community that then created possibly one of the most beautiful expressions of Jewish culture that we've ever had. And so, right, Isaac Luria and then his student, right, Moses Cordovero, right, were responsible for spreading Kabbalah everywhere. And I note Moses Cordovero because Isaac Luria actually never wrote anything. And so if you do a Google search or you want to discover, well, do we have any primary sources from the Arizal, from Isaac Luria, right, you're not going to get anything. And so he was sort of viewed as almost this mysterious figure that we don't know much about, right? All we know about him is from hearsay and rumors, and also what his primary student, Moses Cordovero, wrote about him. And so his student, Moses Cordovero, again, was responsible for writing several books about the Arizal's thought and spreading that throughout the Jewish world. And we touched on some of these ideas 2 weeks ago when we talked about Kabbalah, but just to mention them again, the Arizal is the thinker who's responsible for the idea of Tzimtzum, the idea that to create the world, God had to retract. He is the thinker that's responsible for the idea of Tikkun Olam, right, in a wider universal principle, right? The idea that it's the job of Jewish people to go around doing mitzvot and collecting the sparks in order to bring about the Messiah. And so we can also see how this type of worldview, again, lends itself to a certain type of messianism. Because for all of Judaism before this, if somebody were to knock on your door in the 1300s, and it doesn't matter, it didn't make a difference where you lived, and asked you, what is the point of being Jewish, of keeping mitzvot, of doing all these things, your answer would either range from something along the lines of, this is what God wants from me, so I'm carrying out God's will, to maybe if you're more of a rationalist, you might say, I believe that this is the best set of rules for a society to function, right? Or maybe this is the most meaningful. All of a sudden, the Arizal says, all of those ideas are, fine and good, but this is actually how you bring about this utopian messianic vision for the world through doing these mitzvot. And at a time when Jewish history was in a relatively dark place, because in the 1400s, basically Jews from all over the world got geographically exiled and mixed up, these ideas became extremely popular. And at the same time, right, just to mention one other important book that was created during this time, we also have Joseph Cairo, who also was a Jewish thinker that was born in Spain and ended up being exiled and moving to Tzfat. And Joseph Cairo is responsible for writing what is known as the Shulchan Aruch, which is basically the updated version to Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. And the Shulchan Aruch, which was written in the mid-16th century, is the definitive guidebook of Jewish law for at least Sephardic Jews. And we can complicate that picture a little bit. Of course, there's probably 500 different commentaries that were written on the Shulchan Aruch in the last 300 years. But he writes this new and updated book of Jewish law that importantly combines Jewish legalistic principles from the Talmud and Maimonides with Kabbalistic ideas. And so even just thinking of a lot of these ideas, right, they're all having an effect on each other. And we're starting to build up a very complex sociological set of conditions for our next fun chapter that we'll get to in a moment. So just to go over, right, this will sort of be some quick snapshot of ideas, and because there's still two main things that I want to talk about today. Just in terms of if we see this around the Jewish community or in different Jewish learning opportunities, we know where it comes from, right? So the Arizal and his student Moses Cordovero and this sort of 15 and 1600s Kabbalistic scholars were responsible for a lot of what we think of when we talk about modern Kabbalah and mysticism. And so one of the things that they were very responsible for spreading was this idea of interpretation via numerology, which is the idea that a word and a letter is not just a letter, but all letters actually have mathematical numbers. And it opens up an entire new branch of interpretation where if you, let's take the most, a very common example, right? God's name in Hebrew is Yud Hey Vav Hey. So if each number corresponds to a letter, right? If Aleph is 1 and Beis is 2, Gimel is 3, and so on, God's name adds up to 26. So then let's say you are a rabbi who's looking for a nice speech to give on Shabbat morning. What you might do is say, I wonder what other Hebrew words add up to 26. And you can make all sorts of interesting interpretive connections. So this spread numerology, right? The idea of a dibuk. A dibuk is a possessive spirit. And so the idea that, let's say, Maddie one day shows up and she is acting very not herself, right? So the assumption in a lot of Kabbalistic communities might be that Maddie was possessed by an evil spirit called the dibuk, and you need to do this whole ritual to, I'm forgetting the English word for it, but you need to do this whole ritual to excise the spirit. There we go.
Exorcism.
Yeah. And so again, this is not dissimilar from a lot of general European folk belief, which is why we're going to get to this a little bit later. The rise and spread of Kabbalah in Judaism, and I discussed this 2 weeks ago, but we're going to discuss it again in a much harsher way, had a huge backlash from a lot of the Jewish leadership because they looked at ideas such as dibuks, and I accidentally pressed the next slide, which is reincarnation, which is another idea that Kabbalah brought into Judaism. And so reincarnation means that perhaps Sydney is not just Sidney Jacobson, perhaps Sydney is also the reincarnated spirit of some Jew who lived 200 years ago. And a lot of facts about her life could actually be explained by studying this more ancient Jewish figure, right? And so a lot of these ideas, which ended up into Judaism, did not obviously originate in Judaism. And so you can imagine a lot of other Jewish leaders at the time looking at these ideas and saying these ideas have no place in Judaism. Just a couple more, right? One of the things that the Kabbalists introduced, and this is an idea that actually had a lot of staying power in the Jewish world, is the idea that you should go to people's grave sites to pray it. right? This was not a Jewish idea before, but probably the most famous example is every Rosh Hashanah, right? Breslov Hasidim will travel to Ukraine to pray at the gravesite of their Rebbe. And this is sort of, right, hundreds of thousands of Breslov Hasidim every single Rosh Hashanah will again travel to Eastern Europe from Israel just to pray at the gravesite of the Rebbe of the Breslover movement. And so this, again, especially in Hasidic circles, which we'll talk about a little bit, became major parts of Judaism that, again, before this, were not a part of Judaism. Just a couple more, right? The idea of the golem, and Maddie, I'll take your question in 1 second. We've probably all heard of the most famous golem story, which is the golem that the Maharal of Prague created. And just for people who haven't heard of the story, in the 1700s, there was a synagogue in Prague that was undergoing a series of anti-Semitic attacks. And so the story goes that the rabbi, the Maharal, created this golem, which is this magical being, and he infused it with the name of God to give it animating power. And this golem then protected the Jews who are praying in the synagogue, right? So again, all of these ideas, if we're trying to trace them intellectually, and somebody comes to me and says, I've read through the entirety of the Tanakh, I've read through the entirety of the Talmud, I've read all of medieval Jewish literature, and I just have no idea who came up with these ideas, right? Most of these ideas can be traced back to the spread of Kabbalah in Sfat in the 15 and 1600s. Maddie, what were we gonna say?
Yeah, I had a question about the praying at the graves, because I've seen videos of like the traveling to the site of the Rebbe. How, or is there like pushback on that in terms of like low stakes idolatry, or like how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, no, the answer is yes, and very strongly yes, as we're going to see. And so the Breslov Hasidim who go to Uman, right, in Ukraine every Rosh Hashanah, from the rest of the Jewish world, this is viewed as a type of idolatry. And we'll discuss at the end. This is one of actually, I think, the most interesting debates in Jewish history, which we'll get to at the end, was the rise of the Hasidic movement and the backlash to the Hasidic movement. I think it's the most interesting debate in Jewish history because both sides were basically correct. And we can discuss that in a minute. But yes, these ideas had huge backlash. And even today in the Jewish world, it has huge backlash. I mean, you know, both in the wider Jewish world and even within the Orthodox world, you have some people who say that praying at the graves of rabbis is the greatest thing that you can do. And other people say that it's idolatry. And it's a very interesting ideological tension that's around there. And Ruth said that, you know, certain other Hasidim pray at the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brooklyn, right? That's obviously the Lubavitchers or Chabad, right? Probably the most visible face of modern Hasidic Judaism, because unlike other Hasidic movements that post-Enlightenment became more insular, Chabad did the opposite, which is they specifically spread themselves out. But yet still, if you go to 770 in Brooklyn, right, where their last Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, is buried, right, every Chabad Lubavitcher goes there to pray.
He's not, excuse me, he's not buried there. That's where he lived. He's buried in Queens.
Oh, interesting. I actually didn't know that. So
yeah, I've been there, and it's a vigil 24/7, 365. And I'm sure on an anniversary there, they crowd it, but there's always 20, 50 people there praying.
And
yes,
they consider him the Messiah. There's a whole thing about whether he's the Messiah.
Right.
Exactly. So we'll get into that because the debate that we'll sort of uncover the roots of why you have a situation where tens, if not maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews believe that there is or might have had been a Messiah, and why everybody else disagrees. And somebody wrote in the comments that they're not praying to the grave, they're actually praying to him. Right. This is exactly the problem. And this is why, Maddie, your question was really good, because what's the difference to some extent from viewing a grave as a place of deeper inspiration to pray to God, or viewing a grave as praying to the grave, right? There might be a difference there, but maybe not a big one, right? And it also, you know, just interestingly enough, okay, I'll go down this tangent. I'm gonna kick myself in a second because we have a lot of stuff to go to, right? I mean, even when we consider, right, where we're at in the weekly parshiot, right, in terms of if you ask, well, what's the difference between building the tabernacle in the desert, which is just some nice golden structures, and building the golden calf in the desert, which was some nice golden structures. And so, right, so to some extent, right, it's a similar debate of, do you need something else to harness your prayers to God, like a temple, like a synagogue, like sacrifices, or can you pray to God in sort of a pure form without any intermediaries? And this is a large extent the debate between the rationalists and the mystics, right? If you ask Maimonides, and this is something we covered, right, 3 weeks ago, but I don't know if I gave this example. If you ask Maimonides, what is the ideal form of prayer? It's with nothing, right? His ideal form of prayer might not even have words, right? It's a sheer, unadulterated meditative experience that people have towards them and God, right? What Martin Buber might have called, an I-thou experience. And if you ask the Kabbalists, right, they would say that no, prayer to God involves all these intricate tools and rituals and incense and sacrifice and all this material. And so the same debate, again, carries through to Judaism today, where if you think, right, that praying at a grave harnesses some special spiritual power because of the nature of the person whose grave it is, right? That is one stream of Jewish thought that has its roots in, again, certain medieval positions. And if you believe that that is, for lack of a better term, right, crazy, right, that has roots in another form of Jewish thinking. Okay, so these were all right. Another thing that Kabbalah introduced that became very popular in Hasidic movement is the centrality of going to the mikvah, not just as a female, right, purity ritual once a month, of which the Talmud talks about, but as a mainstream part of Jewish experience. And so, right, one thing that distinguishes Hasidim from non-Hasidim is whether or not you travel to the mikvah, let's say, right, or the ritual bath every day. And this is, again, a big part of more Kabbalistic practice of Judaism that the rest of Judaism, it never really caught on. Okay, so we're now sort of building up to again, one of our fun and great debates, but we have one more city and area to visit first, which is the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So just a little map. And no, I can't understand most of the cities there, but we obviously recognize some. We have Lublin and we have Warsaw and all of these other cities. Now, just a couple things to note about Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth was that it was both, right, this was a episode in history in the 16th and 17th century when what we called the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not just what we consider today to be the modern countries of Poland and Lithuania. It also included most of Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. And so the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth was this huge area, right, in the 1500s. And this was a place of relative tolerance for Jews. And so this ushered in what scholars call the Polish Golden Age, or probably better said, the Polish Golden Age for Jews. And Jews had it very good under the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They had something called the Council of the Four Lands, which is basically a system of self-governance. And Poland was probably one of the best places in the world to be a Jew in the 15 and first half of the 1600s. And we'll discuss why that came to an end in a second, but just to paint the picture, again, of this, just adding to the endless mosaic of Jewish history, of just a series of going to countries, things going well, having success in whatever form that means, and then the host countries and people getting so upset either from the government or from bottom up that Jews end up getting massacred or kicked out, right? Sadly, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, probably a lot of us know how this episode ends, because today there are not a lot of Jews that are living in Poland, just a sneak peek. But again, this was a huge, right, and important episode of Jewish history, right? And scholars estimate that 1/3 of the Jews worldwide in the 1500s actually lived in this area. This was the location of what a lot of people say is the European yeshiva movement. And so I believe the first one was in Lublin. There we go. And again, this is a situation where a Jewish community, much like was alive in Babylonia in the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries that we talked about, right? This was the first yeshiva that was in Central or Eastern Europe, was built in Lublin, that started immediately attracting Jewish scholars from all across the Jewish world. And so again, if we think of Jewish history as a bunch of different cultural centers over the course of thousands of years, right? We obviously have Jerusalem, we have Babylonia, we have Spain, then we have Svat, right? So now Poland and the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth has become a Jewish center, and it's attracting now Jews from all over the world to study, right? Obviously, cities like Lublin, Krakow, which had all of these yeshivot, and probably the most famous person to be produced out of the early Polish yeshiva movement was a rabbi named Moshe Isserlis, and he's most famous for writing a commentary called the Mapa. And now this involves a little bit of Hebrew to understand this pun. So Joseph Cairo writes a book called the Shulchan Aruch, which is a set of Jewish law for Sephardic Jews, right? He's writing this for mostly the exiled Spanish community. And in Hebrew, the term Shulchan Aruch, right? Shulchan means table and Aruch means set. So his book was called the Set Table. And he writes, and I apologize for what I'm about to say because it is not politically correct, but it's not my words, it is Joseph Cairo's words in the 1500s, so you can take it up with him. He called his book The Set Table because he says, this is so simple, just like setting a table, which a woman can do, a woman can also understand this, because I've laid it out so well for him, right? So all of a sudden in Poland, right, they start to get this book, and they get this guide of Jewish law, but it is written according to a very Sephardic-centric perspective. And so Moshe Isserlis writes a commentary called the Mapa, which in Hebrew means the tablecloth, which was then a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch. And so now today, actually, we can actually pull this up because the beauty of the internet means I can quickly show this. So if we go to Sefaria, right, just so we can source a lot of these ideas, right? So if we click on Halacha, which has all the Jewish law, right? So we have Mishnah Torah, which we spent a lot of time talking about. And then we go to the Shulchan Aruch, which Sefaria tells us it's the most widely accepted code of Jewish law compiled in the 16th century. So we click on it, and then we click on just one at random. And so even in the Hebrew, right, I won't spend time dissecting this, but this up here is the Shulchan Aruch, and then this is all the Mapa, the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So the example here, I guess we'll do it because it's actually kind of a funny one. So the Shulchan Aruch, right, this is how this guidebook opens. And it says that one should strengthen himself like a lion to get up in the morning to serve his creator, so that is he who awakens the dawn. And so the Shulchan Aruch, Joseph Cairo says, you should, get up in the morning roaring like a lion before the dawn, right? This very idealistic picture of what your morning should look like. And then you have the commentary of Moshe Isserlis, who's a lot more pragmatic. He says, well, at least one should not delay beyond the time when the congregation prays, which I've always just found so funny, because you have, this sort of mystical idealism of the community, the Sephardic community in Svat. And then once it gets to Poland, right, they're very much, okay, but practically, right, don't get up after 10 p.m. because that's when we pray in the morning. So just as one example of, again, the interplay between these two Jewish communities. We can scroll past all of these. And just to see his grave for a second, speaking about graves, I mentioned when it came to Maimonides, that on Maimonides' grave, right, Maimonides' Hebrew name was Moses. And so on Maimonides' grave, it was famously written, Mimoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe, right? From Moses to Moses, there never arose another like Moses. So on Moshe Isserlis's grave, it says, Mimoshe, Mimoshe, Mimoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe, right? From Moses, which is Moses in the Bible, to Moses, which is Moses Maimonides, to Moses, which is Moses Isserlis, no one arose like Moshe. There's actually going to be one more figure in Jewish history that had the honor of getting that type of accreditation, which is Moses Mendelssohn by some, which we'll discuss next week when we talk about the Haskalah. But just to see how important and central of a figure Moses Isserlis was, right, he merited to be called, right, one of the greatest figures and fathers of Jewish history. Okay, so we are at a high point, of course, in Polish, Lithuanian, right, and this obviously includes Ukrainian Jewish history, and this continues until the Shemelniki uprising. I'm probably botching the pronunciation. I Googled like 6 different ways to pronounce it, and Google didn't really know either. There's also a bunch of different ways to spell it, just in case people see other spelling, but in 1648, one way to think of this is, right, the Cossacks were a people that were, right, mostly made up of peasants, and you could think of the sort of rural farmers, the lower class, and they were mostly from Ukraine, and they felt that they were getting increasingly squeezed by the Polish-Lithuanian elites. And right, there's also some religious interplay there. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was mostly under Catholic rule, while the Cossacks were mostly Eastern Orthodox Christian. And so there was a lot of both geographical, political, and religious turmoil that all of a sudden, right, led to this group of people really wanting a free Ukraine, what they called it, right? And they wanted to free Ukraine from both Polish and Catholic rule. And this led to a man named Bogdan Chmelnytsky to, after being involved in a particularly tough land dispute, he decided that he was going to, he was already a high up in the Cossacks army, but he decided that he was going to gather tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people together and go on a basically rampage west to free Ukraine from Polish and Lithuania. Now, it just so happened that a lot of times, right, because this was a golden age in Jewish history, there were a lot of Jews that were basically spread out throughout the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and a lot of Jews as a direct line and response from a lot of the wider medieval Catholic restrictions on Jews, which of course, even though this was a golden age, Jews still did not have equal rights. So Jews were still relegated to being the tax collectors and the bankers. And if, let's say, I had an estate, right, it would be some Jew who was in charge of running the finances of my estate. And so all of this rural anger, to some extent, was targeted right at the Jews. And they went on this massive rampage that some estimates go up to 100,000 Jewish victims in the Chmelnytsky uprisings, right? And one of the things that this had the effect on, right? This of course was seen as the worst pogrom in Jewish history, right? Obviously, not worse than the Holocaust, but before the Holocaust, this was actually called in a lot of Jewish sources the pogrom, right? Because this was both, right, seen as the most disastrous thing to ever happen in Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple. And also this uprising is what's thought of as scholars to have started the sort of modern pogrom movement. Whereas at this time in Eastern Europe, Jews actually lived fairly well, right? So if you were a Jew in the 15 and 1600s, and you had to choose between Western Europe and Eastern Europe and which place was better for a Jew, Eastern Europe would have been a better place to live. But all of a sudden, all of this resentment was boiling against what they considered the elites in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And of course, whenever people want to blame elites or anything, somehow it ends up being anti-Semitic, right? Because of course, it was steeped in all of the anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages, mixed with all of these new anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews being the rich money grabbers, money lenders, tax collectors, all of those things, which of course they were, but not because they wanted to be, because they were forced to be, that this caused, again, 100,000 victims and 300 Jewish communities were virtually destroyed over the course of a couple months. One of the reasons why this is important, I mean, this is both, of course, important because this was the worst anti-Semitic thing to have happened in about 1600 years in the Jewish world, but it also represents a shift in the way that anti-Semitism would operate for the next several hundred years within wider Europe, which is, this is at a time in history, again, this is before the Enlightenment, but because of the Renaissance and because of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church was sort of on the waning in terms of power. And so all of a sudden, a lot of the worst anti-Semitic incidents to happen in the 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century were not caused from governmental policy, but they were caused from bottom-up anti-Semitism, meaning it was no longer the state that was the primary vehicle of anti-Semitism. It was the populist uprising against Jews, which again presents all sorts of new dangers for Jews because this was much more quote unquote erratic. And one of the things that, again, a lot of scholars talk about in terms of pogroms in Eastern Europe was, right, to some extent, right, I don't want to downplay medieval anti-Semitism, but you sort of knew that it was coming, right, more than just the whim of, right, a couple hundred people in your town getting upset for some reason and then going on a rampage. All of a sudden, for the next several hundred years in Eastern Europe, you're going to have Jewish communities that are just erratically targeted whenever people were upset at basically anything. And so this, again, represents a big turning point in modern Jewish history. Just to show you how complicated the world is, by the way. So this is Kiev right now. And this is a statue of Shalmaniki. And this is the current Ukrainian $5 bill. And he is featured front and center. And the reason why I bring this up is because anybody who's been sort of paying attention to wider Jewish news in the last year, since obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine, anytime, any Jewish article or news source talks about Jewish support for Ukraine, which, personally, I do think Jews should support Ukraine, but they always have about 2 or 3 paragraphs basically saying, yes, we know Ukraine has been one of the most anti-Semitic countries for the past 300 years. Despite that, right, it's still not okay what's happening. But you actually have had a lot of, talk. And one of the tools of actually Russian propaganda is to try to upplay this to the extent where they paint all Ukrainians as Nazis, right? We don't have time to endlessly unpack, the propaganda war that's happening. But it's also true to say that Ukraine has, since this uprising, been one of the most anti-Semitic places. And so just again, talking about the complexities of Jewish history and Jewish identity and modern political events, right? We can hold all of these things. And we can, again, recognize, right, the deep ingrained anti-Semitism here, and also the fact that it doesn't make it okay, right, for another country to invade and butcher, right, innocent people. Okay. I want to go on only because now we have our, right, this is all building up to 2 very fun and important, right? They probably weren't fun while it was happening, but 2 very important events in Jewish history that I find 2 of the most interesting episodes to have happened in Judaism. So after all of this sorrow and heartbreak that was throughout the Jewish world, all of a sudden the Messiah comes. And who is the Messiah? Well, the Messiah is an interesting, erratic, probably manic man named Shabtai Tzvi, who was born in 1626 in Turkey, but then very quickly in 1648 decides to come out and proclaim himself as the Messiah. And now again, right, think about the wider Jewish cultural situation, right? You have a proliferation of Kabbalah and mystical ideas all throughout the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish world throughout the Ottoman Empire. These ideas have also made it across into Eastern Europe. Both the wider Sephardic community and also now the Eastern European Jewish community has just been ravaged by terrible things in their recent history. And all of a sudden, you now have this person, right, this, budding mystic who's also a miracle worker, who all these rumors are spreading about his, miracles and his ability to heal and all of these things, right? He was obviously a very charismatic person. And when he proclaims himself to be the Messiah, right, he does all of these things that are both reserved only for the Messiah to do and also extremely strange. And Shabtai Tzvi ends up being one of the most eclectic figures of Jewish history. I actually really recommend for anybody here who's interested in this to Google him and watch some videos or read some articles about him, because I'm going to try to paint a picture of how erratic he was, but I'm not going to do it justice. So he went around pronouncing God's name. He also publicly ate non-kosher, claiming that as the Messiah, the rules of kosher no longer apply to him. He had a public marriage ceremony, but not to a woman, but to a Torah scroll, actually. And then there were claims, again, this has never been verified, that he was involved in organizing large sexual orgies. And so you can imagine, right, this person, right, again, this sort of populist movement, right, growing among the Jewish community as a direct offshoot from 2 forces: 1, anti-Semitism; 2, mysticism that's sort of gone out of whack. And obviously the Jewish leadership is very unhappy, but Shabtai Tzvi quickly amasses tens of thousands of immediate followers. And so a follower means somebody who is now a Sabbatean, right? Somebody who says, I believe Shabtai Tzvi is the Messiah, right? I'm following him wherever and whatever he does. Some estimates actually say that half the Jews in the Ottoman Empire, so this is now 400,000 Jews were sympathetic, and many, many more in Eastern Europe. Again, they didn't exactly have pew polls back then for the Jews in various shtetls in Eastern Europe, but all the accounts give that, very high percentages of the Jewish world accepted him as the Messiah. And so at any minute, I mean, there are accounts of Jews in Eastern Europe quite literally packing backpacks, because at any minute now, the shofar is going to blow and they're going to end up in Israel. And so this is sort of the height of Jewish messianic fervor, again, because of these two causes of anti-Semitism and messianism gone amok. And all of a sudden, right, we can imagine, right, he was hated by the Jewish leadership, because if you're a leader of a Jewish community and you're trying to maintain some sanity, one, you can tell this guy's probably some sort of charlatan because he's not even doing the right Jewishy things. But two, if you're more of a rationalist or even a realist, right, you can probably tell this 22-year-old who's running around claiming to be the Messiah is probably, right, this probably is not going to end well for the Jews. And, we have some firsthand quotes from him, right? So just so we can read, some of the things that he said about himself in letters to his followers, right? So he assures us that he has not come to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill it. I have come to perfect the world, to repair what has been corrupted, and to return all to its proper state. So this is just, again, another example of, right, what happens when you try to bring utopia too quickly. And right, another quote, right, this is him talking about himself. He says, I am the Lord your God who has come to redeem you. I have descended into the abyss, into the realms of the shells, right, which is a Kabbalistic idea of klipot, right? We don't have to get into that, but in order to raise up the sparks of holiness that have fallen there, my purpose is to bring about the redemption of Israel, to restore the world to its original state, and to reveal the glory of the Lord to all the nations. And so, right, these are some of the ideas, right, that he was preaching. And again, this caught on. Right. And the wider Jewish world had every reason to want to believe that all of this was true and correct, and they wanted to follow him. What happened was, right, as he began to get more and more followers, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, right, he was in Turkey, and he started writing more and more about how he was going to basically march in, kick out the Sultan, become the new ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and then lead the Jews back to Israel. It just so happens that if you are the head of the Ottoman Empire, you don't like it when a person in your empire is now amassing hundreds of thousands of followers and telling everybody that they are going to come march into your palace, kick you out, kill you, and redeem Israel as a promised land. And so, of course, they catch him, the Ottoman Empire, and they put him, and in 1666, he's arrested by the Ottoman Empire authorities, and he is given an ultimatum, right? You either convert to Islam publicly or you're going to be killed. And to everybody's shock, he agrees to convert to Islam. And again, this was a huge shock to all of his followers, because all of his followers, right, thought, okay, this is the moment that everything's going to happen. And once he converted to Islam, this, of course, had a huge effect on the Jewish world, right? One, some of the followers ended up following him and converting to Islam. Two, and I think somebody even wrote this in the chat before, a lot of people still followed him. And today there's actually a separate religious movement called Sabbatianism, or being a Sabbatian. And they are people who, again, are still followers of Shabtai Tzvi. So people who, right, depending on your view, you can decide whether or not you want to call them Jewish or not, but people that still think Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. But again, most Jews that followed him were immediately disillusioned. And this, of course, created a very harsh anti-mystical backlash among Jewish leaders. And so all of this time, for 200 years before this, Kabbalah was spreading and spreading, and, it was sort of free-flowing. And all of a sudden, right, and this is probably something that we've heard before. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard the idea that you're not supposed to study Kabbalah until you're 40, right? That's sort of a common idea that's thrown around, right? So that idea comes from this, right? The Jewish leaders basically got together and were like, we need to stop the spreading of Kabbalah, right? Kabbalah is ending up in all of these, right, terrible situations, right? All these false messiahs. It was actually another false messiah about 100 years after. It didn't capture as many followers, but it still captured tens of thousands, right? A man named Jacob Frank, and still today there's people called Frankists, or, right, out of the other false messiah, Jacob Frank, right? You can Google that if you're interested in learning more. But this had, of course, a huge effect across the Jewish world, leaving the Jews in Eastern Europe, not just right in a sad situation because of anti-Semitism, but now disillusioned because of this right messianic failure. And as pogroms and suffering among Eastern European Jews increased, right, the situation was extremely bleak, which leads to the next major revolution in Judaism. And here, right, this will be the last thing we discuss today, but I think this is one of the most important points of modern Jewish history, and I'll explain why in a minute. We get another revolution called the Hasidic Revolution. And the Hasidic Revolution takes place right after Shabtai Tzvi, right, in Eastern Europe, right? Israel ben Eliezer, otherwise known as a man named the Baal Shem Tov, was born in 1698. So again, if Shabtai Tzvi was arrested in 1666, right, this is the next generation. And the Baal Shem Tov comes onto the scene to an Eastern European Jewish community that again is, has quite literally nothing going for them. And he starts this movement of the masses, right? Again, another, populist. And when I say populist, I'm not giving a value claim to it, but I just mean that it was a bottom-up movement, right? He gained followers from traveling from one city to another, spreading his message. There was no official Jewish leadership system that was trying to raise him up. As we'll talk about in a second, it was actually exactly the opposite, right? Jewish leaders did everything they can to not let him spread these ideas, and starts what is called the Hasidic Revolution, where he starts preaching about a Judaism that is starting to devalue the traditional forms of being Jewish, namely rigid adherence to Jewish law, studying of the Talmud, right? What we might call, right, very halachic Judaism, to all of a sudden talking about a Judaism that cares a lot more about the emotion of religious experience. And so he starts talking about the importance of joy and song and dance and prayer. And if you read accounts of early Hasidim, right, if you showed up to a synagogue on Shabbat morning, it wasn't about what prayers you said, as it might have been, right, in the medieval era. It was about how you said it. And if you were dancing and if you were singing, right, and really tries to infuse life, right, into a Judaism that was in a very somber situation. He introduces even more the importance of meditation, what Hasidim call hitbodedut, right, into Judaism. Another thing that Hasidism introduced was the importance of the Rebbe or the Tzaddik. And now this is where some red flags go up, because what's a Rebbe, right? And for anybody who's ever asked what the difference is between a rabbi and a Rebbe, right, this is going to be the difference, right? So for thousands of years, a Jewish leader was called a rabbi, which has a bunch of meanings, but generally has been, right, termed to mean a teacher, right? It literally means a master, but, right, the general interpretation is a teacher. And all of a sudden, a new type of Jewish leader is born called a Rebbe. And a Rebbe, or otherwise known as a tzaddik, is not just a leader of a community, but it's actually seen as a quasi-intermediary between humans and God. And a Rebbe is seen as somebody who has a more direct channel to God that then not necessarily should be worshipped by people, but to that distinction we were talking about before in terms of praying at graves, if the Rebbe is a conduit to getting to God, that seems very close to praying to the Rebbe as an offshoot of God. And so this, again, sets off a lot of alarm bells in the Jewish, right, intellectual circles because of everything that just happened with Shabtai Tzvi. And because all of a sudden now you have this new movement that's talking about de-emphasizing the traditional forms of Jewishness and overemphasizing the importance of individuality and prayer and, right, having to rely on community leaders in terms of being Jewish. Now, the one other thing I'll say, and I think that this is a really interesting point that basically all scholars recognize, but that seems to always get, right, people confused and upset, not really upset, but like seems to always shock people, that most scholars, and certainly I buy this argument, suggest that Hasidic Judaism actually paved the way for the Reform movement. And what do I mean by that? Was one of the ironies of what happened in terms of Hasidic Judaism is that Hasidic Judaism in the 21st century is not the Hasidic Judaism of the 18th century. if you read accounts of early Hasidic Judaism, it was nothing like, right? Today, if somebody says a Hasidic Jew, right, we all immediately think of these enclaves in Jerusalem or New York, where you have this monolithic culture of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people living in a insular city, right, that are, right, growing up and not learning English, right, they're only speaking Yiddish, right, they're sort of almost like, you know, they forgot to leave the 1800s, right? We all have our stereotypes of what we think when we say modern Hasidism. All of that, from a historical perspective, is post-Enlightenment Hasidim, right? The Enlightenment and the Holocaust had a huge effect on the Hasidic community. The original Hasidism, right, for the first 100 years in the 1700s, was a Jewish movement that basically, I don't want to say threw out, but was willing to bend and shape and morph and play around with the traditional modality of Judaism in search of a more authentic religious experience. And there's a famous story, right? This is probably one of the most famous Hasidic stories. And I thought that the story is actually the paragon of what early Hasidic Judaism stood for. And so I'll read the story and then we could discuss it. So this is a story that's called the Flute. And this story is probably familiar to some of us, but it's worth reviewing again. So we learn that a certain villager used to pray on the days of awe, right, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in the house of study of the Baal Shem Tov, right, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. And this man had a child whose wits were dull, and he couldn't even read the letters in the prayer book, much less recite a holy word. His father never brought him along to the city because the boy was completely ignorant, right? So we get, right, our typical rural farmer, right, who, just as we expect, right, their kids don't know much either, right? And this would have been a person, again, in more Jewish intellectual circles, right, which, just like all elitist circles, right, by definition are elitist, right, this person wouldn't have had much value as a part of the religious community. But when the boy became bar mitzvah, his father took him with him to the city for Yom Kippur, so as to be able to watch him and keep him from eating, from simple ignorance, right? This 13-year-old was so ignorant, he didn't even know you're not supposed to eat on Yom Kippur, so the father said, I'll bring you with me to synagogue, right, so I can babysit you. Now, the boy had a little flute on which he used to play all the time when he sat in the field tending his flock. He took the flute with him from home and put it in his coat, and his father didn't know about it. The boy sat in the house of prayer all Yom Kippur without praying because he didn't know how. During the additional prayer, right, the Musaf prayer that's added in Yom Kippur, he said to his father, Father, I want to play the flute. His father became terrified and spoke sharply to the boy, as flutes are against Jewish law on Yom Kippur, right? You are not allowed to play instruments according to Jewish law on Shabbat or holidays, right? So what happens? The boy had to restrain himself. During the afternoon prayer, the boy repeated again, Father, let me play on the flute. Seeing that the boy wanted badly to play on the flute, his father said to him, Where is the flute? The child pointed to the pocket of his coat. The father therefore held the child's pocket in his hand to keep the boy from taking out the flute and playing on it. Holding the pocket with the flute in this way, the man stood and prayed the closing prayer, Ne'ilah. In the middle of the prayer, the boy forced the flute out of his pocket and blew a blast so loud that all who heard it was taken aback. When the Baal Shem Tov heard the sound, he shortened his prayer. After the prayer, the Baal Shem Tov said, With the sound of this flute, the child lifted up all the prayers and eased my burden. For the child does not know anything, but by dint of his seeing and hearing the prayer of Israel, all of this holy day, the prayer's holy spark kindled the fire in him, and the flames of his longing burned higher and higher until his soul nearly expired. Because of the strength of his longing, he played the note of his heart truly without any distraction, for the sole sake of the name of God. Now the pure breath of his lips were acceptable to him, and by this means, all of our prayers were lifted up. Right? This is an incredible story, right, in understanding the philosophy of Hasidic Judaism. And as I said on the last slide, the philosophy of much of liberal Judaism that we practice today, which is this is talking about the authenticity of religious experience as a value that's higher than rigid adherence to Jewish legal code, right? This story, to some extent, is a wider metaphor for what Hasidic Judaism did to Judaism, right? And did, right, again, I'm not giving a normative claim, I'm giving a descriptive claim, right? They took, right, the entire metaphor is the Jewish people have this, right, authentic expression of religious experience that they want, but Jewish law, as personified in this father, is holding them back from it, right? And so all of a sudden, this metaphor of the child bringing out the flute, openly breaking the laws of Yom Kippur, is a more authentic experience of Yom Kippur than adhering to the legal code of Yom Kippur. Now we can see why this had terrifying and terrible backlash to people in the parts of the Jewish community, because this is explicitly saying, right, it's not about the action, it's about the intent behind the action to some extent, right? Other parts of the Jewish community said, yes, you finally got it. It's not about the action, it's about intent behind the action. And so Hasidism opened the door, right, for contemporary forms of Judaism that are not necessarily halachic, but that would claim what their expression of religious experience is just as high, if not higher, as somebody who is only paying attention to the rigid legal codes of Jewish law, right? So this, again, is a paragon of Hasidic Judaism, right? Starts to reshape the rest of Judaism, or at least the followers, right? Hasidism was a movement of the masses, right? Because this, again, can speak to, right? Think about even the metaphor, right? The farmer's son who was ignorant is viewed as the hero of the story, not the person who sent their kid to Jewish school that already knew the entirety of the Talmud at age 13. And so, of course, right, and this will be the last thing we get to today, this started a huge backlash. So much so that a movement began to grow that was called the Mitnagdim, which literally just means in Hebrew, those who oppose. And they very quickly banded together all of the Jewish leaders of the world at that time, and very quickly excommunicated the Baal Shem Tov, right, from the Jewish community. And an excommunication back then, right, next week we'll talk about Spinoza, who's of course a little bit before this, but next week we'll talk about the Enlightenment, right? An excommunication was not me going up to Ruth and saying, you know, Ruth, it's best if you don't come to synagogue here anymore, right? An excommunication was somebody saying, I hope X person dies and rots in hell and may God avenge their soul. And right, it was a lot worse than what we might think, right? And so they immediately began to excommunicate him, saying that he was the worst heretic, right, in possibly the history of Judaism. Just to see a couple of quotes, and we'll go back to the slide, right? The chief mitnagdid, right, the head of the opposition, was a rabbi named the Vilna Gaon, right, who again is a very important rabbi. And so he quickly drafts all these letters to the other Jewish leadership to try to convince them that, right, Hasidism is no good. And so just even a couple quotes, right? These lies are coming from the mouths of those who call themselves the new students of wisdom, who have no shame and are not afraid of God. They have deceived the masses with their false miracles and nonsense, right? Another letter, they believe that their leaders have the power to perform miracles and they can control the spiritual worlds. They have forgotten the true path of Torah study and observance and instead have turned to false mysticism and falsehood. These so-called holy men are leading the masses astray with their false teachings and claims of mystical powers. They are using these claims to gain power and influence and are causing great damage to the Jewish people. I see with my own eyes that they are empty and devoid of true wisdom and knowledge. They are like wild beasts without understanding or reason, and they are leading the people astray. Right, so if we think that current tensions in the Jewish world are at an all-time high, right, it just takes a little bit of glimpse into various historical chapters of Judaism to know that we've always had very intense ideological debates with all sides saying what you're doing is not only not Jewish, but the most antithetical thing that Judaism's ever seen, right? And so this, again, starts, right, this opposition movement. And some of the points that they debated, right, were, again, this question of subjectivity of religious experience. And this is going to become a major debate that I think even still stays along in Jewish community. So just to portray it again, right? Is Judaism more than rigid adherence to Jewish law? And even today, right, among Jewish communities, you have very different opinions, right? The offshoot of the Mitnagdid camp, right, what a lot of people call modern day Litvaks, or in the Orthodox world, you call them yeshivish, or another offshoot is actually the modern Orthodox movement, the movement that I grew up in, was a very stark Mitnagdid movement, right? Probably one of the best representatives of a modern Mitnagdid thinker is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, right, who was one of the great Jewish leaders of the 20th century, who writes a book called Halachic Man, right, which is one of his seminal works, right? I strongly recommend it, even if you read it and hate every page of it, right? It's just a very interesting philosophy that he delineates. And one of the most striking scenes of Halachic Man is that, right? He basically writes this book to talk about how the only important, or Judaism is basically reducible to Jewish law. And so he describes the scene where he's walking through a meadow and he sees a stream and then he sees a sunset. And the whole time he's not paying attention to the beauty of nature, but he's saying, okay, the sun has set. Now it's time to daven Mariv. Or I wonder if this lake is big enough to be used as a ritual bath, right? Like the whole thing, right? And it's written very poetically, but this is sort of a direct logical conclusion of this type of worldview, right? To see the offshoot of the Hasidic movement, right? You don't have to look very far, because I think to some extent, all liberal Jewish movements, including the Reform movement, are offshoots to this other, right, idea, which is that, yes, the subjectivity, and when I say subjectivity, I don't mean you can come up with whatever you want, but the idea that there are other emotional or personal or sociological factors that are more important than the strict letter of the law. And when can you play around or even break Jewish law for the purpose of something greater? So just like the boy should be playing the flute, let's say, people should be using Zoom on Shabbat, even though if you open up the Talmud or the Shulchan Aruch, it will say, thou shalt not use Zoom on the Sabbath, right? Not actually, but it'll say other things that lead modern day Jewish legal thinkers to say that, right? People that are in the Hasidic camp or the modern day liberal camp would say, yes, but just like the boy playing the flute, this is the more authentic form of modern religious experience, right? So again, we could see this debate unfold, right? Another debate was obviously whether or not mysticism should still be spread out to the masses, right? If you look at a lot of Hasidic Jewish, even current day yeshivot or Jewish schools, they teach a lot of Kabbalah and mysticism, whereas if you go to a lot of non-Hasidic schools, right, they're not really teaching mysticism, right? Pantheism, we discussed this a couple weeks ago, but obviously Hasidim are much more pantheistic in terms of direct monotheistic. And again, the last thing is the centrality of intellectualism, right? The Mitnagdim were intellectuals first. And so what's important in Judaism is Torah study and intellectualism and all this, right? And subjective or emotional religious experience is very much secondary, right? And the Hasidim obviously disagreed. And so this will be just the last slide, because I think it's important, right? So the overall effect on this debate. Now, one of the interesting things that happened about 100 years later is once the Enlightenment happened, the Jewish world was involved in a much bigger debate than just this debate. And so the Hasidic Mitnagdi debate basically like rise and fell over the course of 100 years. And it was the most important debate in really Jewish history up until this time, but then it was quickly surpassed by reactions to the Enlightenment. But the overall effect on this debate was that it tempered the more extreme Hasidic ideas. And so if you actually go and read some of the primary sources of Hasidic Judaism, you'd be amazed at the stuff that you find there in terms of, right, worshiping of people and rituals and all of these things. And a lot of these ideas were tempered as, right, both of these movements spread and began to fuse. I made up this word, but I think it's a good word, the Hasidification of general Judaism, which means, again, in everybody's practice, they are involving things from Hasidic Judaism, like, again, even the most staunchly non-Hasidic person still would tell you that to have an emotional response to prayer is important, right? As opposed to prayer being a religious thing that you check off, right? You know, if you read the Talmud never says, thou shalt have a deep religious experience when you pray in the morning. The Talmud says you should pray in the morning, and then debates about what exactly that prayer should be, right? And then this is the last important thing for today, right? It was the beginning of the modern yeshiva movement, and one of the big effects that Hasidism had was Hasidic Judaism was, again, a movement of the masses, and the opposition of the Hasidic movement were mostly the intellectual elites. And so one of the effects that Hasidism had on the wider European Jewish community was it forced the intellectual elites to realize that they actually need to speak to the masses in order for them to counter the ideas of Hasidic Judaism. And so this actually had a really beneficial effect, because it meant that yeshivot, which at this time in the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth were reserved only for the elite, of the elite, right? So basically the only yeshivot options were Harvard and Yale, and if you can't get in, okay, you'll be a farmer. all of a sudden, right, the equivalent of what we might call community colleges and public schools started opening up everywhere. And every Jewish community began to have Jewish schools and modern yeshivot. And so the first one was in Volozhin in 1803, but very quickly, yeshivot began to spread. So the Mir Yeshiva, Yeshiva of Warsaw, right, all of the yeshivot that would be the central yeshivot in Central and European Europe started opening up, and not just opening up to the people who got the top 1% of whatever the Jewish equivalent of the SAT was, but to make it as an ideal that every Jew, and I put every in quotations because of course it was basically male Jews, right, would have been open, right, and welcome to have Torah study. And I end off today with just this this really interesting graph that I saw, just to set us up for next week, and just to explain what this is. So this is Jewish population in Europe by century. So just another way to view everything we discussed today. And I know it's exactly 7 now, so it'll be done in about 30 seconds. So just to explain this graph. So on the bottom, we have years, right? So this starts off in 1170, but we can sort of see the years increase. And on the top, this is the number in thousands. So on the top here, this is 10 million. On the bottom here, this is 1 million. I don't know why they did it like this, but this is 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, as follows. And so we can see, right? So we started off today in about, right after 1492, right? You can see the effects of the expulsion from Spain because population drops for about 100 years, right? This is Jews leaving Europe and going to the Ottoman Empire. And then from the 16 to 1700s, population slowly rises. And then from the 17 to 1800s, right, you have this huge population boom from about 1 million to almost 9 million Jews in Europe. And right, this is mostly right consistent with general population statistics. So it's not that anything specifically happened that was causing tons of Jews to move here. But if you look at general European populations, this isn't too far off in terms of mirroring the population boom. But this is going to set us up for, again, next time we're going to talk about, right, once you have, right, 9, almost 10 million Jews in Europe. And of course, the period from the 1800s to the 1900s was a crucial time in world history, right? The Enlightenment, emancipation, right? It's when Zionism started, right? All of these things, right? So this sets us up quite nicely to really enter into modernity next week. So I will unshare my screen. Like always, I'm always happy to hang around and chat for a little bit. And I know that we have a lot of, today also was sort of a lot of facts on the board, but I hope that it'll open us up for a nice ideological conversation next week about Jewish reactions to the Enlightenment, which of course we are still in today to some extent, depending on which Jewish communities we are in. And again, if anybody has questions or thoughts or anything, I am here.
I think you need to breathe. This was great. I just had to lie down because I still have jet lag. I'm sorry.